Hello everyone and welcome to Teaching Literacy. I thought it would be a really great idea if I could give you a bit of an overview so that you can get your head around what's coming up over the next 12 weeks. Now obviously I can't talk about all of the learning materials and all of the assessments in too much detail because I'd be here for another hour. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a brief overview so that you've just got a bit of information about how each assessment looks and where we're heading with some of the content. So what I've done is I've broken it down into the weeks. So first off with week 1, it's a bit of a standalone week and a lot of the learning materials focus around what is in assessment 1. So you've got to make sure that you read the content really carefully and ask your ELA if you need any help understanding some of that content. We're having a look at multiliteracies. And this also ties in with the learning demands or literacy demands that we're also going to have a look at with A1 as well. We're also having a look at the sociocultural perspective so that we begin to understand that language and literacy often changes, and it often changes in different contexts depending on where we're using it and perhaps how we're using it. When we have a look at weeks 2, 3 and 4, we get to spend a bit of time, so 1 week each, looking at the Australian curriculum standards and strands for literacy, which is one is called literacy, one is called literature, and one is called language, all starting with L just to make it extra tricky. So each week we're going to break down what it means exactly when we look at literacy outcomes, what does it mean exactly when we look at literature outcomes, and what does it mean exactly when we look at language outcomes, because they're all covering reading, writing and speaking and listening, but they're doing it in different ways. So for example, when we have a look at the language strand, you'll see that it's a lot more to do with the conventions of language and sort of more of the mechanics of language to do with grammar and phonics and the mechanics of learning to write, whereas literature focuses more on the content of reading and looking at different literature types and looking at character development, looking at motives of the author. So there's lots of different parts, and literacy can be quite complex, so they've broken it down into those 3 strands. I'm going to break them down for you. In week 5, we look at collaboration and the importance of being able to discuss all of the ideas that I just talked about above. There's so much to cover, and students really need to be able to vocalize what they think and justify their ideas and opinions. So we talk about the importance of collaborating in group settings. In week 6, we have a look at planning and pedagogy, and we also have a look at the idea of that there is so much to cover in literacy, and we as teachers need to make sure that we're achieving a balance in the classroom. So we put that idea under a bit of scrutiny. Within weeks 7, 8 and 9, that's when our A2 assessment will start, which I'll explain in just a moment. But looking at each of these weeks, in week 7 we're having a look at reading, in week 8 we're having a look at writing, and in week 9 we're having a look at speaking and listening. And the focus of each of these weeks is talking about strategy. So how can you effectively teach reading? What are the strategies that you're going to use? What are the approaches you're going to use? What are the programs? What are the tools? We need tools to be able to teach these different things. So that's what each of those weeks is focusing on. In week 10 we have a look at assessment, and it's also primarily having a look at NAPLAN, I suppose the pros and cons and what can be gained from using some of the data. In week 11 and week 12 we spend a little bit of time in week 11 debating some of the current literacy issues, because as you'll find from week 10, you may agree or disagree with some of the things that have come out, and you get to debate your own issues. And week 12, we have a reflection about what we've learnt. So that's just a nutshell statement of what's coming up for you. Each of these relate to the assessments really nicely, and as I said, assessment 1 has a lot of content within week 1, so you need to spend a bit of time perhaps even going over some of that stuff. With assessment 1, it's an individual report, and it's 1,250 words, so it's actually not too long at all. It's a really nice one actually to start off with. It's not overly long, but long enough that you can get your teeth into it. It is due in week 5, so that gives us a few weeks to get settled and get our heads around the content. This assessment is focusing on having a look at the demands on literacy. So you would have noticed when you're looking at your week 1 readings that they talk a little bit about inquiry model and critical model, and looking at all these different ways that we can teach literacy now and the things that affect and challenge and change the way we teach literacy. You'll know that, you know, things within teaching are always constantly changing, and we're always trying to improve our practice. So what are the things that are influencing us as teachers in the way we teach literacy? And then we're going to make some connections to the Australian curriculum, because if we say that a particular demand is having an influence on us, we should be able to see evidence of it in the Australian curriculum. Another big focus of this report, which I think makes it kind of fun, is that we get to mix modes. That means that you need to present 2 modes. So it's not just a written essay this time. You're going to have to include some, I guess, text, or you could have some audio, you can add some visuals, you can make it a Prezi, you can use PowerPoint, you can let your imagination run wild and present it in an interesting way, and it's really quite fun, and I enjoy marking them a lot. That was worth 25% of your mark, your overall mark. Assessment 2 is great as well because it gets us all onto the discussion boards in week 7, 8 and 9, talking about reading, writing and speaking and listening. So you are actually required to post. It is a requirement, not something that you can just choose to do like it is in other weeks. You actually do need to post twice in weeks 7, 8 and 9, because you're going to remark about what you've learnt about a strategy about reading, writing and speaking, listening in those weeks, and then you're going to comment on somebody else's post. We've had great feedback about this assessment where people are so happy that there's lots of engagement in the DB and lots of learning happening, and they use this to then complete their individual component, which is due in week 10, and that's 500 words. So you're going to talk about some of the things that you learnt from your discussion board posts. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. I've just kept it very brief, and I don't want to bombard you with too much information. We'll talk more about that when the time comes a little bit closer. That is worth 25% of your overall mark. Assessment 3 is quite a big one, and I know that it often can cause a little bit of anxiety because students see that it's worth 50% of the mark, and it causes a bit of worry. So I'm always very, very mindful of this, and I always try to give information as early as possible so that you feel like you are not rushed and you have plenty of time to complete the task. So we always have Flip Collabs out really early. We try and do our interactive collab sort of midway through, so that you've got time to still ask questions, and then you've got time to put your answers into practice so that you don't feel rushed. So just be wary that we are mindful of it from our point of view. We want to make you have the best chance of succeeding with this last assessment. So it's got 3 sections. It's individual, and it is due in week 12. As I said before, I can't go into too much detail, but basically what you've got is 3 sections. The first one is an analysis and a reflection on your A2. So you will look back at your A2 and you'll say to yourself, wow, you know, there were some really interesting points that came out about reading, and I'm going to investigate one of them. Or perhaps you'll have a look at speaking and listening and say, hey, that person said, you know, this and this and this about speaking and listening. I'm not sure if that's quite true. I might research that a little bit more and find out some more about it. So it's really fun because you get to have a look back through the posts and, you know, challenge some ideas or maybe extend on them. And you also get to write a reflection on how you felt about having to post and contribute to the DB during assessment 2. Section 2, you get to collate some resources. So you'll find 3 resources, obviously to do with reading, writing or speaking, listening, and you'll analyse them. And section 3 is a vision statement, which basically it's really nice. I love reading them because they always make me feel really inspired. It's basically your thoughts on how you want your literacy classroom to be. So the idea is that you've spent 12 weeks learning about literacy. This is the last literacy unit in a culmination of 3 units. So you should therefore be able to sit down and say, Sorry, I need a drink. You should be able to sit down and say, I am going to teach literacy like this. This is what it's important to me in terms of literacy teaching. These are the strategies I'm going to use. And you talk about what your classroom is going to be like. So they're really lovely to read, and as I said, make me really inspired. So I hope you guys will be too. As I said, it's 50% of the mark, but we're going to give you heaps of time and heaps of support, so it's definitely not anything to worry about. I hope you enjoyed my little overview, and I'll catch up with you guys soon.